The hall fell into a tense silence the moment Benjamin Netanyahu's voice thundered through the chamber. He slammed his hand on the table, leaned forward, and hissed with that familiar mix of anger and arrogance, "Africa can't stop us." His words were meant to intimidate, to dominate, to remind everyone of Israel's military power. Cameras zoomed in. Delegates stiffened. Even some of his own advisors shifted nervously in their seats. But across the table, Ibrahim Traoré didn't even blink. He sat with his hands clasped, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, like a soldier who had already survived worse storms than Netanyahu could ever imagine. Then, slowly, almost too calmly, Traoré tilted his head and replied, "Then why are you running?" The room froze. For a moment, Netanyahu's confident posture faltered. That single question, sharp, clean, lethal, cut deeper than any speech, any debate, any threat. Israel's prime minister opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for a defense that simply didn't exist. Traoré didn't wait. He leaned in, voice low but carrying across the microphones. Real power doesn't need to justify itself. Real strength doesn't hide behind bombs, blockades, or excuses. If Africa can't stop you, his eyes locked on Netanyahu's. Then why do you fear its voice? Why do you fear its unity? Why do you fear me? The journalists in the room erupted with furious typing. Cameras clicked like machine guns. Netanyahu looked cornered, not by armies, but by truth. And for the first time that day, it wasn't Israel's leader who controlled the narrative. It was the young captain from Burkina Faso who had walked into the room alone. And made the most powerful men on earth feel small. The room tightened the moment Traoré leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Netanyahu like a hunter studying an animal pretending not to be cornered. Netanyahu tried to laugh off his own trembling, but the cameras were already recording the truth, the Israeli prime minister's fingers tapping, his voice cracking at the edges, the unmistakable signs of a man who had finally met someone who didn't flinch. Running? Netanyahu snapped again, forcing a smirk. "We don't run from anyone, least of all Africa." His words were sharp, but they fell flat, collapsing under the weight of Traoré's silence. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your jets run. Your ministers run. Your excuses run," he said calmly, every word slicing through the tension like a blade through cloth. "And now you run from consequences." The officials in the room shifted uncomfortably, pretending to scroll on their tablets, pretending this wasn't the moment a smaller nation's leader was exposing the fear inside a man who claimed to command a regional empire. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. He was used to dealing with leaders who stuttered around him, who spoke in rehearsed diplomatic rhythms. But Traoré's tone carried something different, certainty. "Africa cannot stop us," Netanyahu repeated, but this time it sounded like he was trying to convince himself, not the room. Traoré leaned forward, his voice steady and cold. "Africa stopped you the moment you underestimated us. The moment you forgot that oppression always births resistance. And the moment you believed fear would silence us." Netanyahu blinked, his composure slipping. Traoré continued, "Tell me, Netanyahu, if Africa can't stop you, why do you look like a man waiting for an escape route?" The silence that followed was heavier than any bomb. The room didn't cool down after Netanyahu's outburst, if anything, it boiled hotter. Diplomats shifted in their seats, the air thick with the kind of tension that only comes when a man in power realizes he's losing control. Netanyahu leaned forward, forcing a smile that fooled no one. "Africa can't stop us," he repeated, slower this time, like he needed to hear himself say it. But Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He didn't even move. He simply tilted his head and said, "Then why are you running?" It hit the room like a slap. Every camera turned. Every whisper died. Netanyahu's face froze, not in anger, but in something far worse, exposure. Traoré had seen it clearly. The man who claimed to dominate the Middle East was scared. Not of armies. Not of borders. But of a new world rising, one where Africa refused to kneel. Netanyahu scoffed, trying to recover. "Running? From who? From you?" Traoré's smile deepened. Not from me. From justice. From consequences. From every innocent child whose name you buried under rubble. Several diplomats inhaled sharply. Even U.S. delegates exchanged worried glances. No one spoke to Netanyahu like this, not publicly, not privately, not ever. You think you can lecture us? Netanyahu barked. I don't think, Traoré said. I reveal. And that was the moment the psychological tables flipped. Netanyahu's confidence cracked, his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. He tried to appear unfazed, but Traoré had locked onto the truth, the kind you can't hide behind speeches or military force. The truth that Israel's prime minister was no longer feared, but cornered. Traoré leaned forward slightly, enough for the microphone to catch every word. You call Africa weak, he said softly. Yet every time the world condemns you, you point your fingers at us. You blame us. You argue with us. You challenge us. He paused. Who fears who? The hall erupted, not with applause, not with cheers, but with a stunned silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had deepened. And for the first time all night, Netanyahu had no answer. Netanyahu's jaw tightened as if Traoré's words had hooked straight into his pride. He leaned forward, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Africa doesn't decide anything here. Israel does. America does. Power does. The room tensed. Not because of what he said, but because everyone sensed he was trying to convince himself, not Traoré. Traoré didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even shift his posture. He simply let silence work for him, letting Netanyahu's performance hang in the air like a bad smell. When he finally spoke, it was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. If you truly had power, you wouldn't be explaining it. A few diplomats in the back exchanged looks. Netanyahu noticed. His eyes darted. Too quickly, to the side. And Traoré caught it. That single motion. That micro-panic. That instinctive glance of a man who feels a threat he can't name. There, Traoré said, pointing lightly at Netanyahu's jittering hand. That's what I'm talking about. Netanyahu glared, but Traoré continued before he could breathe out another rehearsed line. You say Africa can't stop you. Yet every time you talk to me, your voice shakes, your eyes dart, your breath shortens. If Africa can't stop you. He leaned in just an inch. Why are you the one trying to regain control of the room? Netanyahu opened his mouth, but no sound came. Traoré didn't stop. He pressed harder, not with volume, but with truth. The kind of truth that cuts deeper than any insult. You fear what you can't predict. And you can't predict Africa anymore. You can't control us. You can't buy us. And worst of all, Traoré tilted his head, you can't intimidate us. A hush fell. Cameras zoomed. Aides froze. For the first time in the entire confrontation, Netanyahu looked like a man remembering the limits of his own power. So tell me again, Traoré whispered. Why are you running? His voice was soft, but the echo shook the hall harder than Netanyahu's shouting ever could. The room froze when Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Netanyahu like he was dissecting a lie he'd heard 1,000 times before. You say Africa can't stop you, he said quietly, almost gently. The kind of calm that makes generals sweat. But every tyrant who raises his voice at us eventually loses his voice, and then his courage. Netanyahu tensed, fingers twitching on the edge of his chair, trying to mask the shift of unease crawling up his spine. Cameras captured everything, the slight tremor in his jaw, the tightening of his grip, and social media was already exploding outside the building. Traoré didn't stop. He never stops when his opponent starts unraveling. Tell me, Benjamin, he continued, his tone sharpening like a blade pulled across stone, why does a man who claims Africa is powerless keep glancing at the exits? Netanyahu sat back, but not in confidence, it was retreat disguised as posture. He muttered something about regional threats, but Traoré cut him off with a raised hand. No. You're not afraid of threats. You're afraid of the truth. And today, the truth has a uniform, a voice, and an entire continent behind it. The Israeli delegation began whispering nervously, shifting papers, pretending to reorganize documents that didn't need reorganizing. Netanyahu attempted to stand, but Traoré's next words pinned him to the seat harder than any soldier could. "You told the world Africa can't stop you. Then why do you flinch every time we speak? Why does every sentence I say make you shrink another inch? Leaders who aren't afraid don't run. But you've been running from accountability since the first stone fell on Gaza." A silence heavier than smoke settled over the hall. Even the security teams paused, watching, waiting. Traoré straightened his shoulders, the lights catching the pattern of his uniform like the armor of a warrior carved from the history of his people. "You want to talk power?" he said. "Power isn't in bombs or borders. Power is in standing for the innocent. And the moment Africa stood up, you started running." The room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Reporters who had been leaning back in their chairs were now sitting upright, sensing headlines in the air. Diplomats stopped pretending to check their phones. Even security at the edge of the hall subtly repositioned themselves, as if they too understood the danger of two worlds colliding in plain sight. Netanyahu inhaled sharply, trying to recover ground. "Africa thinks it can lecture Israel," he scoffed, his voice trembling beneath the surface. "You're continents away. You have no power here." Traoré tilted his head, slowly, deliberately, like a soldier evaluating a threat that didn't know it was already defeated. "No power," he repeated. "Then why do you keep saying my name? Why does it echo in your meetings, your briefings, your fears?" His words struck like a hammer, measured, heavy, undeniable. Netanyahu flinched, a fraction too visible. Traoré took a step closer, just enough for the microphones to feel the shift. "You accuse Africa of weakness," he said. "Yet you look over your shoulder every time an African nation stands up. You're afraid of something you can't bomb. Something you can't blockade. Something you can't erase." He paused, letting silence do what no speech could. "Unity," Traoré finished. "That's what you fear." Netanyahu attempted a smirk, but it collapsed halfway. "You think unity can stop missiles?" he asked. Traoré's reply was instant. "It can stop empires." A murmur spread through the hall. Traoré wasn't done. "You wage war on children," he said, each word cutting with surgical precision. "You bomb families and call it strategy. You create orphans and call it victory. And then," he leaned in, eyes burning with intent, "you tell the world Africa can't stop you." He straightened his uniform. "But you're already running. Not from armies. Not from governments. From justice." Netanyahu froze. Traoré delivered the blow that ended the exchange. "And justice travels faster than your fear." The hall erupted, not in applause, but in stunned breathlessness. The kind that precedes the headlines that rewrite reputations, careers, and futures. "Shall we continue?" Traoré asked calmly. Netanyahu said nothing. The room froze the moment Traoré leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Netanyahu like a predator studying a cornered animal. The Israeli PM tried to adjust his posture, tried to summon that usual televised arrogance. But it wasn't working. Not in front of a man who had fought real wars, buried real soldiers, seen real consequences. Traoré's stare wasn't political. It was military. It was the look of someone who had already decided the outcome. "You think Africa can't stop you," Traoré said, voice low, steady, and lethal. "Yet somehow you keep looking over your shoulder." Netanyahu flinched. It was tiny, almost invisible, but everyone saw it. Cameras caught it. Advisors saw it. The world saw it. A man who feared nothing suddenly looked like someone waiting for the floor to collapse beneath him. Traoré didn't let him breathe. "You've built your power on fear," he continued. "Fear of Gaza. Fear of truth. Fear of justice. Fear of the world waking up. And now, fear of Africa. Netanyahu snapped back, trying to recover his edge. Africa won't stand between Israel and its security. Traoré chuckled, and that laughter carried more threat than any shouted speech. Security, he repeated. Bombing civilians isn't security. Leveling cities isn't security. Killing children isn't security. That's panic. That's desperation. And desperate men run. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. A vein pulsed in his forehead. Traoré leaned even closer. You're not running toward victory, Traoré said. You're running from consequences. The silence was suffocating. A journalist dared to whisper, "Is that true?" Netanyahu slammed his fist on the table. "We are defending our nation." Traoré raised a hand, not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to silence the entire room. "No," he said. "You are defending your fear. And fear makes men do reckless things." The camera zoomed in on Netanyahu's trembling hands. It was happening again, the unraveling, the exposure, the humiliation. Every time he stood against Traoré, the same thing happened, his voice rose, but his power shrank. Traoré straightened his posture, shoulders broad, expression calm. "If Africa chooses to act," he said, "you will understand that the world you mock is the world that will decide your future. And this time, running won't save you." Netanyahu swallowed hard. He looked small. Smaller than ever. "Tell me," Traoré added quietly. "If Africa truly can't stop you, why are you running before the fight even starts?" The room felt colder the moment Traoré leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, icy calm that cut sharper than any shout Netanyahu could muster. "You say Africa can't stop you," he repeated, almost whispering, then his eyes narrowed, and the entire hall leaned in. But every tyrant who said those words, ended up running. Netanyahu stiffened. Cameras zoomed in. He knew Traoré wasn't speaking only about Israel or Gaza, he was speaking about history, about empires that rose with cruelty and collapsed under their own arrogance. And suddenly, Netanyahu looked like he felt the weight of all of them on his shoulders. Running? Netanyahu forced a smirk, one that trembled just a little at the edges. "Israel does not run." Traoré shook his head slowly, almost pitying him. "You're already running," he said. "Running from justice. Running from consequences. Running from the truth. And deep down, you know Africa will not run from you." A murmur spread across the chamber. Diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. The African delegation sat straighter, their expressions burning with a sudden, unified pride. Netanyahu slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. Africa is irrelevant to this war." Traoré didn't blink. "Africa is the reason you're shouting," he replied. "If we were irrelevant, you wouldn't fear our voice. You wouldn't fear our unity. And you wouldn't fear what comes next." Netanyahu opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. It wasn't silence born from defiance, it was silence born from realization. Traoré had exposed it. The fear. The cracks. The trembling. Then Traoré delivered the line that made every camera light flare at once. "If Africa couldn't stop you, you wouldn't be begging the world to stop us." And just like that, every diplomat in the room felt the shift, the momentum leaving Netanyahu's grasp, pulled effortlessly into Traoré's hands. The chamber had turned into a battleground of silence, one so thick it felt like it carried its own gravity. Netanyahu tried to steady himself, gripping the edge of the podium as if it could anchor a sinking man. But Traoré was already moving toward him, each step deliberate, each breath cutting through the air like a warning drumbeat. Cameras zoomed in. Delegates leaned forward. Africa, for the first time in decades, wasn't just present, it was commanding. Netanyahu lifted his chin, forcing out a shaky laugh. "This is propaganda. Africa doesn't decide the fate of nations like mine. His voice aimed to sound strong, but it quivered around the edges. Traoré stopped just a few feet away, enough for every microphone to capture his words with surgical precision. "You keep saying Africa is powerless," Traoré said, "yet every time I speak, you flinch. Every time we rise, you panic. Every time we defend the innocent, you call it a threat." His eyes locked onto Netanyahu's. "Maybe Africa is not your problem. Maybe your fear is." A murmur rippled across the UN hall. Soft at first, then louder, like a wave gaining height. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. "You think you can intimidate me? I lead one of the strongest militaries on earth." Traoré leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a dangerous calm. "Armies don't make you strong. Standing for the innocent does. And you," his gaze narrowed. "You run from the innocent as if they're the ones chasing you." Netanyahu's breath hitched, caught live on every camera streaming to millions. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Not a word. Not a sound. Just the trembling flicker of a man whose confidence had finally cracked under the weight of truth. Traoré straightened, turning toward the hall. "Africa is not here to threaten anyone," he said. "We are here to end the threats, to children, to civilians, to humanity itself. And if speaking that truth makes tyrants run," he paused, glancing back at Netanyahu. "Then let them run." The roar that followed shook the room. The chamber fell into a strange, breathless quiet, like the air itself was waiting to see what Traoré would do next. Netanyahu leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, fingers tapping the table with the impatience of a man who suddenly realized he wasn't in control anymore. Cameras zoomed in. Delegates whispered. And Traoré, standing tall in the center of the storm, didn't raise his voice, he simply let the truth hit harder than any threat. "Prime Minister," he said, the words sharp as steel, "you said Africa can't stop you. But look at yourself now. You're running from every question, every consequence, every innocent life you buried." Netanyahu scoffed, but it came out weak, almost cracked. "Africa doesn't dictate to Israel." Traoré stepped closer. Not aggressively. Not theatrically. Just enough to make the entire room lean in. "Africa doesn't need to dictate," he replied. "Your fear does that for us." Gasps. Audible. Almost synchronized. Traoré didn't stop. "You bomb Gaza, and the world watches. You threaten Lebanon, and the region trembles. You shout about strength, but a strong man doesn't fear the truth. A strong man doesn't hide behind excuses. A strong man doesn't run." Netanyahu's eyes flickered, cornered, exposed, shrinking under the weight of a man he thought would be easy to dismiss. Traoré pointed toward the giant screens behind them, which were now flashing images of destroyed homes, children carried through smoke, families digging through rubble with bare hands. "This is what you run from," Traoré continued. "Not Africa. Not me. Your own actions." Netanyahu slammed his hand on the table, out of anger, out of desperation, out of the sudden feeling that the room was slipping away from him. "Enough." Traoré didn't flinch. "Enough," he repeated. "Tell that to the mothers you left crying in the streets. Tell that to the children you buried under buildings. Tell them you are the victim. Tell them you are the one who deserves sympathy." The chamber shook with murmurs. Some delegates nodded. Others hid their reactions, but their silence was louder than applause. Then Traoré delivered the final sentence. The one that froze Netanyahu where he sat. "You said Africa can't stop you," he said quietly. "But today, I didn't stop you with armies or weapons. I stopped you with a mirror. And you couldn't even look into it." The room erupted. Some clapped. Some whispered. Some simply stared at Netanyahu, no longer as a leader untouchable, but as a man stripped bare by a soldier who refused to bow. Traoré turned, walked away from the podium, and the cameras followed him, because the world had just decided who looked like a leader. And who looked like he was running.